वेलकम टू अ सीरीज नेशन स्टेट डायलॉग राष्ट्र राज्य संवाद श्रृंखला में आप सबका स्वागत है. 欢迎大家收看我们民族国家对话系列. My name is Nehal Ulman and I am the moderator for today's discussion. Today we have with us Professor Xing Professor Emeritus, College of Communication, DePaul University in Chicago, United States of America. The topic of today's discussion is deciphering the role of rhetoric in political communication. Professor Xing has been associated with the DePaul University since 1992 as a professor. She completed her Ph.D. in Rhetoric and Communication in 1991. She has many publications in the form of books, journal articles, as well as chapters in edited volumes. In 2017, she was awarded the Excellent Teaching Award at DePaul University. Welcome to our series, Professor. We are honored and happy to have you with us in this dialogue series. So without taking much of time, I would request you to please briefly introduce us to your research on rhetoric and also your publications, including your recent book on Mao Zedong's rhetoric.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ulman. And thank you, Professor Kocha, for giving me this opportunity to share my research and thoughts on this great topic. I'm truly honored to be part of this dialogue. I have done research on the comparison of classical Greek and ancient Chinese rhetoric between the 5th and 3rd century BCE. I published a book on this topic in 1998. I received a book award from the National Communication Association in the US for my pioneer work on non-Western rhetoric. And this work has challenged Eurocentric perspective and approach to the study of rhetoric. So that's my early record of my research. And from there, I moved to the study of contemporary political rhetoric. This is because I was born and raised in Mao Zedong's China and experienced the Chinese Cultural Revolution. I'm sure you've heard about it. Your Chinese is very good, Mr. Ulman, in which my parents were persecuted and my family, along with the millions of other Chinese families, suffered greatly during this political campaign. I actually carried with me some horrible memories and stories of the Cultural Revolution into my adulthood, and I constantly had nightmares. So that's the motive for me to work on or do research on contemporary Chinese political discourse. Having trained in rhetoric in the US, I became more sensitive and reflective to the rhetoric used during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976 and the rhetoric of Mao Zedong. Mao Zedong is the top leader of the People's Republic of China from 1949 to 1976. I decided to write the book of Rhetoric of the Cultural Revolution first. So I analyzed the rhetoric used in this 10-year chaotic period as I experienced firsthand. The book was published in 2004. Afterward, I started working on rhetoric of Mao Zedong. I analyzed his speeches and writings from 1913 to 1975, the year before his death, and published the book titled The Rhetoric of Mao Zedong in 2017. In this book, I identified the themes and styles of Mao's rhetoric in the construction of Chinese nationalism and in the construction of new communist persons. I analyzed his rhetoric in promoting his political theory of class struggle and in the context of foreign policy as well. Mao was very good at referencing history and Chinese classics using moral and emotional appeals, as well as some common sayings in Chinese language. So his rhetoric was actually very effective in transforming Chinese culture and Chinese people. He often used metaphors, superlatives, and sometimes profanity when condemning his political enemies. In both books on Chinese political discourse, I discussed how Chinese political rhetoric had impacted and transformed the Chinese culture, thought, and communication. I took a textual and contextual approach in my interpretations of political rhetoric and analyzed the power of rhetoric for both Chinese, drawing from both Chinese rhetorical tradition and by applying Western rhetorical theories. That's about my research.
It was very nice to listen to your introduction of your research. And I feel that our viewers will also read your book to know more about how the Chinese leaders have used language and rhetoric, in the political scenario in China. So, my next question to you is regarding the same. And I believe that the use of language, I think, is one of the most important aspect of political communication. So political rhetoric evolves from the language itself. Can you please explain the role of these rhetoric that play a course in the politics? And how does one determine what rhetoric should be used for a specific, scenario or a situation?
Absolutely, I definitely agree. Language is such an important aspect of political rhetoric. I strongly believe political rhetoric has power to create self-perception, such as national identity, and perception of other nations and peoples, and even in changing people's behaviors or induce actions. Political leaders and the mainstream media are the crucial figures or players in the use of political rhetoric. They can use rhetoric to create myths, illusions, making false claims or empty promises to mobilize the society toward a common goal. They can use rhetoric to shape or reshape cultural practices and ideological beliefs, or the way language is used. They can also use rhetoric to divide a nation, instigate hatred and violence, shape the public perceptions of reality. This has happened in Stalin's Soviet Union, Hitler's Germany, and Mao's China. This is also what President Trump has been doing in the United States. Political leaders can also unify and generate positive social change through their use of rhetoric, such as Gandhi, Martin Luther King, and Mandela. A good political leader must have the moral character, putting people's interest above their self-interest. In addition, a political figure with eloquence and rhetorical competency always or tend to have more chances to persuade and influence their audience. Like a famous Roman rhetorician Quintilian has defined rhetoric as a good person speaking well. So at any rate, political rhetoric can transform a society through their moral, emotional, and rational appeals. In deciding what rhetoric should be used in a specific scenario, the first step is to understand your audience, their background, motivations, attitudes, needs, desires, so that you can adapt your messages to the audience. For example, speaking a group of working class or farmers, a politician may want to use plain style in the choice of words rather than academic style for educated elites. The person should also consider internal and external constraints of the scenario, such as if the audience is friendly or hostile, if the audience is cooperative or in defiance. So most importantly, the speaker should be ethical and knowledgeable, good at using emotional appeals for a good purpose. These emotional appeals include pride, fear, hope, and shame. In presenting an argument, a politician or political figure should provide credible evidence to support their views. This is so important. Engaging the audience with rational thinking rather than manipulating them with the false claims. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Yeah,
Yes.
yeah, definitely, ma'am. The leaders have to understand the people's aspirations, and
Yes.
then their rhetorical claims should not be false. But however, we see that leaders also have their own plans or visions, and in that sense, the US and China are also in culturally and civilizationally they are different. So do you see that there are any differences in the concept of rhetoric that they promote, and do you believe that trust issues can arise between the two nations because of lack of understanding of each other's culture, history, ideologies, and mindsets that is reflected in the use of these rhetorics? So
Yes.
that is my question. And is there a reason why people tend to term these rhetorics as empty talk? So can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. American rhetoric, I have lived in this country for over 30 years and studied rhetoric of Western history of Western rhetoric. I think American rhetoric is pretty much based in the Greco-Roman tradition, which values the power of speech and rhetoric in discovering truth, motivating the audience, and persuading the audience. So it's based on also on democratic system that allows freedom of speech and provides many public arenas for rhetoric, such as the use of judicial rhetoric in the court or deliberative rhetoric in the political context or debates. People tend to identify with the political leaders or speakers when they appeal to the needs and desires of the audience. Even rhetoric has a bad name in American society if they don't think there's anything substantive, like the media or politician would say, this is just a bunch of rhetoric. And it's not true. I think rhetoric still has a tremendous impact on how people think, believe, and communicate, especially political rhetoric. So whether it's from political leader or traditional media like TV or newspaper, or even from social media. In ancient China, by contrast, rhetorical practices are largely restricted to the domain of political consultation between ministers and kings or emperors. So philosophers like Confucius and Lao Tzu, they actually value action more than speech. They disliked glib tongues, deprecated speech. Confucianists believe that words must match with the reality and be followed by action. This is the essential quality of a person in ancient China. But this has been changed in contemporary China. In contemporary China, especially after the communists took over China in 1949, Chinese political rhetoric has become the center of and permeated into Chinese people's life. Influenced by the propaganda style of rhetoric from the Soviet Union and dominated by Mao's assertive and often aggressive rhetorical style. Chinese political rhetoric has become a propaganda machine characterized by sloganeering, formulaic, numerical, and militant. So during the Chinese Cultural Revolution, language of violence was rampant, which led to physical violence. Even the Cultural Revolution ended over 40 years ago. The generation that had grown up during the Cultural Revolution, during that period, are still very much influenced by such antagonistic rhetoric nowadays. Consequently, I see huge difference between China and the US in how they think rhetoric functions and how they use rhetoric in the political context. Currently, Chinese political leaders like Xi Jinping uses rhetoric to create a sense of unity, patriotism, nationalism, and authoritarian control. While in the US, President Trump's rhetoric is often perceived as polarizing and divisive. Recently, Joe Biden, the president-elect, has been using rhetoric of unity, hope, and reconciliation. So there's definitely a trust issue here. Culturally, China is actually a collective culture similar to India, collectivistic emphasis. Ideologically, China no longer espouses communism as its core ideology. It's actually more pragmatic in its economic policy and authoritarian in governing. However, China is still perceived as a communist, socialist country in the world, while the US or India, like your country, believe and practice democracy, value freedom and liberty. So in that sense, there's definitely a trust issue. Another area is China has been taught in their history lessons that the country has been plundered and semi-colonized by Japan and Western powers. So in that sense, well, at the same time, US has a short but vibrant history of rapid economic development and domination in the world in many aspects. So the Chinese tend to see themselves as victims of Western invasions and kept collective memory of nearly 100 years of humiliation by Japan and the West. So that makes the trust issue very problematic because of that part of history. Even US during the World War II has helped China defeating the Japanese, but severed the relationship with China since 1949 after Mao took over. It was not until 1972 when Mao invited President Nixon to visit China, the people of both countries began to interact and get to know each other. So, but nowadays, China has become the world's second largest economy that posed a threat to US. So I would say the mindset of US towards China has shifted from China as a poor and developing country to an economic competitor and threat with authoritarian rule. So all these differences, in my mind, create trust issues. Yeah.
Definitely. These issues are also, they emanate from the culture, the history, as well as the way of thinking of the people.
Yes.
You have rightly put down this point. I think the next question that I should ask is about the domestic audience as well as the international audience. So are there any differences in the way Chinese leaders communicate with the domestic audience and the international audience? And are their rhetoric just empty talk, or do they have some purpose? And the most important thing is, how do you identify such a rhetoric? Like, I can say that maybe China Dream is a rhetoric, but what is the criteria behind, saying that China Dream can be a rhetoric?
Yes, a good question. I personally don't think there's a huge difference between the domestic audience and the international audience when China's leaders speak to. However, there are differences between their public rhetoric and their private rhetoric. Like Mao wrote articles against his enemy using similar rhetoric to both the domestic audience and the world audience in order to boost nationalism at home and a strongman image abroad, calling US paper tiger, imperialists, calling Chiang Kai-shek, his political enemy, plague, bed bugs, and dog droppings. But in private, according to my research, Mao tried to make amends and reach out to his enemies to make peace. So I do not think this is characteristic of Western rhetoric, but actually an interplay of yin and yang rhetoric in diplomacy that is rooted in the rhetorical practices in ancient China. The yang here refers to what the rulers or those in power would say in the public. They would use moral appeals or evoke some patriotism, unity, or hatred towards enemies in strong and aggressive tone. But they may have a soft strategy and try to negotiate a peace deal in private with their enemies. In the practice of you shui or traveling persuaders during the spring and autumn and Warring States period, that is roughly 700 to 200 BCE. These traveling persuaders advised state kings to practice benevolent governing, but at the same time also teaching them tactics of how to gain benefits and reduce costs through a private negotiation with their opponents to reach some kind of mutually benefited deal. So I also see a similar pattern in Xi's rhetoric. Xi has appropriated a lot of Mao's rhetoric. In Xi's current dealings through his rhetoric towards the US, especially the trade war and Taiwan and Hong Kong, his public rhetoric represents or presents himself as a strong man, okay? Promoting nationalism, very tough image with a very strong tone. But in action, he and his teams are negotiating with these opponents to try to reach a deal of peace. So therefore, I think for Chinese rulers in the past and leaders today, their words and actions may not necessarily match. Most of the time, their public rhetoric maybe is just empty rhetoric, as what you said. So this seems to be the case that China's public discourse, especially in diplomatic relations, like using warnings, showing muscles through threats. Well, in private, they may negotiate some kind of mutually agreed strategies, and they may take a softer approach in action. So that makes Western audience or non-Chinese audience hard to really understand what's going on in the mind of Chinese leaders. Yeah.
Definitely, this is I think this is the cultural difference that plays a role over here in the way they speak and the actions that take place. So definitely very enlightening. And yeah, I think you answered my last question where I was there was one article in Global Times which was, warning India and teaching India a lesson that was published. So most of the Indian viewers view it as antagonistic rhetoric. So taking this as an example, I want to ask you, what are your views on the use of antagonistic rhetoric in political communication, especially in the diplomatic communication? And does the ancient Chinese rhetorical culture also have, traces of such use of rhetoric? I think you have already spoken about Yo Shui. I think, So are there any other, is this a part, you can say, part of the Chinese classical rhetorical culture?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say so, because I think you must know this already, that there has been always this interplay between Confucianism and Taoism, okay, in political governing throughout Chinese history. So in the public rhetoric, leaders or rulers would use Confucianist rhetoric, which advocates benevolence or benevolent governing, 君子, be a good person, whatever, or collectivism. Okay, but in practice, in private, they tend to use they tend to take a Taoist approach that is more strategic, okay? More of using some measuring or leveling benefits and costs, and considering all different factors before they reach the final solution. So that's something we don't see because that's under the table. It's this private setting, but so it doesn't really match very well with the public rhetoric. Coming back to global times, I occasionally go online to read their articles, but I do know Global Times of Huan Ribao is a radical left news media in China, and its chief editor Hu Xijin is notorious for his aggressive rhetoric. So I did read articles that with some harsh title or words, like warning India and teaching India a lesson. So I agree with the Indian scholars that this is an antagonistic rhetoric towards India. I think largely the antagonistic rhetoric is the influence of the rhetoric of the Cultural Revolution. In my book on rhetoric of the Cultural Revolution, I analyzed the rhetoric of dehumanization, rhetoric of radicalization, and rhetoric of violence through the use of slogans, like calling class enemies parasites, bloodsuckers. And they also use this term warning a lot towards class enemies or teaching them a lesson. So it's already become kind of habitual linguistic phrase that these characterize this kind of antagonistic rhetoric. And even, I said earlier, even Cultural Revolution, the political campaign has ended over 40 years ago. The influence is still there, because the generation like my generation grew up with such kind of rhetoric. So even currently, if you see the social media among the Chinese, both over at home and overseas, you see a lot of the use of language that very much characteristic of Chinese Cultural Revolution, and which kind is in a lot of degree also related to Mao Zedong's rhetoric. I personally do not think China wants a war with India, but the government allows the radical left media to use antagonistic rhetoric to show their own people their toughness and resolute. In reality, I believe Chinese government, including Xi Jinping, would prefer a peaceful solution with India. Because China realized, just based on my own readings and knowledge, that China really needs lot of time of peace or peaceful time to build the economy, to concentrate on economic development and make life better for the Chinese people. This is their promise to the Chinese people, and this is their legitimacy for governing. A war with any other countries, even with Taiwan, even taking over Taiwan, I think is just kind of whistle blowing. It's just a threat, or empty rhetoric. It may not materialize. Okay. I also have come across a book written by Shang Quanyu. I don't know if you heard about him. The book is called China 尼赫鲁时代中国和印度的关系 China and India relations during the Nehru era. But this book is published in 2009. But I think the theme of the book is very good. It talks about, it reviewed the good relationship between China and India at the time. And it calls for looking for similarities and respect for differences between the two countries, and avoiding any political and ideological interferences and biases. Especially, I like what he said about we should use neutral and soft language so that we can achieve peaceful coexistence. Okay, so I think that there's might be some kind of contestation of ideas, and also in terms of rhetoric, in terms of how we deal with foreign countries, in this case, India. So I'm hopeful for improved relations between India and China, even after recent military clash. I have a very good friend, Tan Zhong. I don't know if you know him. His father, Tan Yunshan. I'm good friend of their family. The two generations have done so much for trying to bridge the gaps between India and China. And also Tagore talked about grand harmony between the two civilizations when he visited China in 1924. Okay, and he was well received by Chinese intellectual elites at the time. Yeah, I have a good collection of Tagore's poetry. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Actually, I think it was a very enlightening reply. And as you have rightly said, this antagonistic rhetoric is of help to no one. In fact, I believe that rhetoric should be smart enough to help initiate a dialogue between, dialogue in diplomatic communication, a dialogue that can help countries to, or the opposite party to solve any kind of outstanding issues rather than, creating more issues. So antagonistic rhetoric will only nullify the role that rhetoric plays in terms of, building relations. Definitely, thank you very much for a wonderful dialogue with us.
Thank you.
Yeah, I believe that our viewers might have also learned a lot from this, and we definitely have learned a lot from this. Thank you for participating in our series. Thank you very much for watching our episode. We will meet in the next episode soon. Keep watching and keep learning. Bye-bye.